Shall I fire ahead?
No, hang on. So good evening, welcome. My name is Ben from our Bookshop in Tring. We're scooting in here from various different parts of the country. I believe, Vicky, are you furthest away in Edinburgh?
I'm sure I am. I can't believe there's anyone further away, but you never know.
Benedict, where are you zooming from?
East Bristol.
Bristol. Oh, that's nice and close. That's all right. That's not too. That's 2 hours away. And Nick?
And I'm going to copy Ben. I'm also in Bristol. I'm in North Bristol.
You are. Is that your sort of connection with the BBC, that you're part of the wildlife down there? Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, very much so.
Good. So, and welcome to all the audience. Thank you so much for joining this wonderful event. As many of you may have seen on our social media, this week or this last few days has been the Apple Fair in Tring, and I think Nick and Ben may have done a few Apple based events this month. It's sort of it's thematic certainly in this country to celebrate the apple, and so we had a march through the town on Saturday that looked very much like something to do with the Wicker Man. Honestly, people dressed up in a kind of scary garb, and but it's mightily impressive and beautifully community. So I was asked, what should we do? And sure enough, the key thing is offer some sort of author event. And the eminent Apple-based books going out at the moment, Nick and Ben's book, which is so... Thank you guys for joining us. The format tonight, Vicky is in charge. She's going to be asking the questions. Audience, you're also in charge, so you're going to be asking questions that we'll field in the second half. Please use the Q&A function. You all know the form. We've done over 150 of these things, and audience are always incredibly good about this. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Vicky Allan.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I'm Vicky Allan, and I'm a big tree lover, and I've written a book called For the Love of Trees. And I was absolutely delighted to read Nicholas and Benedict's book, Orchard, A Year in England's Eden, in fact. And it's a beautiful book full of life and really lyrical. It's really a lovely read. And I just thought I'd start by asking you, I think it was you, Ben, who came across the orchard. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, this was just before my main TV days. I had a quiet period in my career, otherwise known as unemployment, and I was doing a lot of voluntary work for the BTO, British Trust for Ornithology, looking for lesser spotted woodpeckers, which are these beautiful little dappled miniature woodpeckers that really only frequent these very old landscapes, very rich in deadwood, lots of ancient trees. And you always kind of read in the books that they're found in orchards. But I think I've been to 50, 60 orchards, hadn't found any. A lot of those orchards were very quiet, they were very sprayed, they're very tidy. And then one day I stumbled across this orchard, and it was an absolute riot of song. Everything was singing. There were cuckoos, there were flycatchers, there were redstarts, there were lesser spotted woodpeckers all drumming to one another. And I thought, well, there must be something going on here that's different to what's going on elsewhere in the countryside. It was like I'd sort of stepped into the 1950s or something. So it was 6 o'clock in the morning. So fortunately, I left it a little time before knocking on the landowner's door. And I said, do you mind if I have a walk around? So she said, yes. So I had a walk around, and I came back and I said, this place is amazing. I said, it's not changed in 50 years. And she said, no, it's actually not changed since the 1930s, because we've never sprayed it. We've never tidied it. We farm in tandem with nature. All of this stuff that you think is accidental, it's deliberate. We're leaving this orchard deliberately for nature. I thought, what an amazing thing to do. So I started studying it, putting up nest boxes, and then 2 years later, Nick and I met on Springwatch, and it sort of went from there.
So, and there aren't very many of these traditional orchards left in the country, are there? So I wonder if one of you could maybe talk about why that is, because, there would have been so many of these around, wouldn't there?
Yeah, there would have done. I mean, we were once the fruit growing capital of the world. We refer to the Garden of England with Kent, but we also have the phenomenal fruit growing counties of right down into Sussex, where the old maps show that you just had hundreds and hundreds of connected orchards, these huge, vast landscapes of fruit trees. And that persisted right up until sort of the pre-war period. There were still lots of orchards. We were growing a lot of our own fruit. A lot of our fruit was sold internally. And then we went through this period post-war where intensification and globalization happened at the same time. And in a very short space of time, the vast majority of those traditional orchards were grubbed up. Now, if you go to the supermarket and you buy an apple, there's a very good chance that apple is anything from 6 to 12 months old. It will have been kept in a refrigerated unit in a large warehouse on an industrial estate, probably not even in this country. It will have been flown in from one of the major now fruit growing regions in Brazil, South Africa, New Zealand. And that is what is stocked on our supermarket shelves. The pride that we once had in producing our own food, selling it locally or within the country, was lost over just a few decades. And as a result, these small traditional orchards simply couldn't compete, and they were grubbed up. They're a farmed landscape, and they're still being grubbed up in favor of a crop that the farmers can sell.
Yeah, I do find it very depressing when you go into a supermarket at this time of year and you see that, what's there is some apples from South Africa. And in your book, I think you mentioned some very early on, some historian, or maybe it's a person at the time, talking about the threat, the fact that of importing just from early, in the early industrial revolution almost. It's like suddenly things were moving around and they could see from early on that this was going to change the landscape.
Well, so when I was researching the history of orchards, there was this kind of golden age from about the mid-1550s through to the early 1800s, when we had the entire counties. I mean, Herefordshire was described as one continuous sea of apple blossom, because you could take a horse and cart from one end to the other, and all you could see would be what we would now call a traditional orchard. At the time, was just called an orchard. And we can still see this in Eastern Europe. It's not a fantasy, but people are just feeding their own at the 10-kilometer level, at the 50-kilometer level. But of course, we were the first country to industrialize almost everything. Globalization, mechanization of farming, grubbing out orchards. So we've been taking out orchards for a long time, since the 1850s. And, there were people in Herefordshire realizing over a century ago that Herefordshire was this extraordinary kind of museum of orchard trees, of things like the Betty Prosser pear tree, which now 13 trees exist in the world. So the Betty Prosser pear is rarer than a Siberian tiger or a white rhino. These have become these trees that we kind of created, but then forgot. So we've got this extraordinary wealth of fruit that we could grow in our country again in the future, like Nick says, if we just change the subsidies, if we change the model, if we pay farmers to farm fruit, then we could still have that tradition back, but we're a very long way from that at the moment.
So you've tasted the Betty Prosser, I imagine, both of you, is that right? Yeah. What was it like?
We will have tasted the end product as a fruit. I'd imagine if you took it off the tree, it would just be a bitter, gnarly. These are cider and perry producing fruits. Eating fruits. Mm-hmm. So I'd imagine, it'd be interesting to see what biting into it. I don't know about you, Ben, but I've never bitten into a cider apple or a perry pear. But I'd imagine they're just.
I've bitten into one. I didn't get as far as finishing it.
Yeah.
But I think the point is, across Herefordshire, there are perry pears, there are cider pears, there are tomputs, there are apples that can do all three. There are culinary pears, culinary apples. So there's this extraordinary heritage and wealth of different types of fruit trees for every possible taste. There are whole apple trees that were designed for sauces in Tudor times, that they only did sauces to go on pork. So that there's this amazing heritage kind of still just about there, locked in these old orchards, like these kind of precious art gallery pieces, but nobody's taking any notice. And, that's very sad.
One of the greatest things in those really old traditional orchards is you'll often have just one or two specimens of particular varieties of tree, and it's that variety, that age. You get lots of different age class of tree, but you also get this huge variety in different specimens, and all of those different types of fruit will be in one orchard, so that it's productive for as long across the year as possible. And Ben writes in the history about how those fruits were traded amongst communities, you know, in exchange for all sorts of things, including as part of wedding arrangements, that fruit trees would move between different families, you know, from one local area to another. And there are still scraps of that left. If you go and look through those traditional orchards, you can still find those individual trees like the Betty Prosser.
So how old are the oldest trees in this orchard?
Apple trees don't have the longevity of an oak. So a really beautiful old specimen might be about 100 years, 110 years. The problem in our orchard also is the soil. So potentially you can go to the New Forest, you can find really old bird cherries or pears that are maybe 200 years, 250 years. But in Herefordshire, where we are, the soil is very rich in clay, so it becomes very waterlogged. And what you'll have after around 100 years is the whole rootstock just breaks free from the ground. And you know, that's it. Down covers the tree, which of course isn't a problem provided somebody's always planting the next generation of trees. But it's generally these really old trees that are home to the fungi, the beetles, the lesser spotted woodpeckers, the tawny owls. It's when they stop being just a fruit tree and they become a whole ecosystem for bats, for beetles. And those are the trees that we end up spending most of our time looking into, I think.
Yeah, because I gather that one of your big things is really about too much tidying up, you know, the way that we tend to tidy up dead trees. And you know, I know that Isabella Tree also talks about it a lot, you know, that you need to leave the tree there in the landscape.
I mean, this is a really recent phenomenon. I mean, if you walk into any urban park, I would argue in any city across the British Isles, deadwood is tidied up because it's considered unsafe. The health and safety revolution, or you know, just determined that deadwood should be removed from trees, and councils will go around systematically removing deadwood, which is perfectly safe for people. They're far more in danger of being hit by a car crossing the road to look at the dead tree than of a limb ever falling off the dead tree. But with this obsession with tidiness has meant that the ground below the trees is completely sanitized of anything resembling a meadow, and the limbs on the tree are lopped off constantly, making that tree far more susceptible to infection. And the deadwood, the product which feeds the invertebrate life, which is so abundant in something like a traditional orchard where the deadwood is left, is removed. Whereas those traditional orchards and those, you know, enlightened parks and farms like Knepp, as you say, with Isabella Tree and Charlie Borrow Run, they're rare landscapes, but the results speak for themselves, because they have the deadwood, we call them the biodiversity engines. You know, a deadwood layer allows everything else to thrive because it's producing the food. It's producing that food at the bottom, which everything else depends on.
The amazing fact is there's actually more life in a dead tree than a living tree, which a lot of people find very counterintuitive. But it's also been found in Białowieża in Poland that when dead trees fall to the ground, they actually create barriers, which makes it very difficult for browsing deer that don't like tripping over these vast trunks to get into certain areas. So those actually become nurseries. So you've effectively got dead trees are quite literally creating the conditions for the next generation of saplings to come out of the ground. But we've become so ecologically, well, in many ways, illiterate in the UK, because these processes that you'll see all over the place in eastern Poland, the farmers aren't tidying the dead trees everywhere, you know, black poplar, willow, all rotting away, lesser spotted woodpeckers and wrynecks nesting at the edges of farms. But we've been tidying now for 40, 50 years. I refer to it as ecological tidiness disorder. It's a very British affliction whereby we, as Nick says, just sanitize the landscape. And the aggregate effect of that is devastating. Hedgehogs, lesser spotted woodpeckers, willow tits, long-eared owls, all of these species, they need scruffiness, they need dereliction, they need decay. And we're not giving it to them, conservationists aren't giving it to them, but places like orchards are these refugia where these processes are still playing out. So in some ways, we think of our orchard as more similar to the New Forest than a lot of nature reserves, because it's got those processes that are being allowed to play out in that 50-year timescale, which is fantastic.
So what were the kind of incredible things in terms of biodiversity that you did find there? Or, were there particular moments when you were like, wow, I found this?
Oh, there are lots. There are loads. I mean, there was a period where we kept coming across carcasses on the ground. We'd come across a pile of magpie feathers, and then we'd come across a pile of pigeon feathers, and then a few weeks later we'd come across a pile of pheasant feathers, and we were trying to work out what were causing these. And we thought initially it must be sparrowhawks. We occasionally seen sparrowhawks through the orchard, and then one day Ben and I were standing in the central orchard, and we were looking at one of the drumming oak, we call it. It's our favourite tree to spot lesser spotted woodpeckers in. And we just happened to glance up over the woodland, which is adjacent to the orchard and owned by the same people. And above the woodland were a pair of birds rolling in the sky, doing this wonderful flight where they'd go up, grapple their talons, and fall out the sky. Then they went up again. And then the one of the birds, the smaller bird, did this very slow flight. And we both got our binoculars onto it, and we both went. And we hadn't seen goshawks there. Goshawks are still a rare species down where we are, but they have really recovered well throughout that Herefordshire belt. And that was one of the species. Tiny. You read in books that goshawks like these dark, dense woodlands where they squirrels and things, but this was a little scrap of woodland next to an orchard. A very open landscape, and there were a pair of goshawks breeding quite happily in there. That was one of the ones.
That sounds incredible. I don't know. There was a slight glitch there. I don't know if Benedict's getting it as well. That there's been an occasional glitch in what you were saying, but it happened just at the right moment there, which was the moment of excitement.
Just had my face on screen. Pause. Suspense.
Yeah. And in terms of invertebrates, maybe as well. What are the really special things that you're seeing there?
Well, there is a beetle that we haven't yet found, although we have found its poo, which is far more exciting than it sounds. There is a beetle. There's a deadwood specialist that particularly specialises in old apple trees called the noble chafer, and again, the noble chafer was once a far more common beetle, but because of this ecological tidiness disorder, this removal of the deadwood that they absolutely critically need for the vast majority of their life cycle, they're rare to see. But just occasionally we look into some of these rot holes and find these large pellets of frass. And frass is the name given to beetle poop. And you can tell, under a microscope, you can get a good idea as to which group of beetles are pooping that out. And we know that there are noble chafer beetles that have been using those orchard trees. But beetles, we're used to seeing them as adults, but they spend the vast majority of their life. Sometimes they spend 99% of their life in deadwood or underground. So they need that, and by removing that, you never see that. We're used to seeing maybugs in season, or stag beetles or rhinoceros beetles, and we love seeing the large adult beetle, but the vast majority of the life of that beetle, sometimes 7 years for the case of some stag beetles, is spent underground eating away at deadwood. So just another great example of why you need to leave as much deadwood in the landscape as possible, so that we get rewarded by seeing these fantastically large beetles, which are a phenomenally important part of the food chain.
I think two of my favourite encounters that have both involved dead trees. One of them, I was walking past a semi-fallen apple with this huge kind of dead stump coming out of the top. And I heard this tiny little cacophony of birds and spotted this woodpecker hole. I thought, oh, it must be a great spotted woodpecker. Then I looked at it again and I thought, this is the size of a 50p piece, right? With a little family inside it. And I literally sat back about 10 foot. And this incredible little lesser spotted woodpecker, only maybe 500 pairs left in the UK, now almost as rare as golden eagles, lands on the tree, and they always reverse down. They're like little clockwork toys, and just started feeding some huge moth caterpillars to its chicks. And I just thought, this is like something out of another world. Most people can go their whole life without seeing this bird. I know birders who think it doesn't exist. And to be able to sit in this kind of agricultural environment, watching this critically endangered species, raising a family, watching it go to the willows, make a decision, get some caterpillars, go to the oak trees to vary the menu, get some different caterpillars and come back and just sit there was extraordinary. And then, of course, when Nick got involved with the photography side of things, we were going for this shot that we call the close wide, which is where the camera's actually really close to the nest, which allows you to focus on the bird, but you get the whole landscape behind. And Nick really kind of authored this look for the amazing pictures in the book. But to see these little lesser spotted woodpeckers that you're told are so cautious of people, literally perching on the camera to rearrange the caterpillars, to then hop onto their nest hole, and basically the camera just becoming a part of the orchard, was fantastic, because these are human environments and these birds can survive us, provided we give them places to nest and places to feed. So that for me was the all-time highlight, I think.
So have you been back to the orchard lately, or is it, I mean, obviously you were going for it over 5 or 6 years, weren't you? Are you?
Oh, yes. Absolutely. And autumn is, of course, a fantastic time to be there, because obviously the cuckoos, the redstarts, the spotted flycatchers and the swallows have all left. They're now south of the Sahara, which is just an incredible thought. But the bullfinches, the marsh tits, the thrushes, they're all teaming up, raiding the hedgerows. So you've kind of got this dual raiding going on. You've got David collecting his Perry materials, if you like, collecting the apples, but you've also got the fieldfares and the starlings and the thrushes trying to get there first. So it's an absolute feeding frenzy at the moment.
Yeah, one of the best sort of fallouts from writing Orchard is we've been contacted by quite a few other orchard owners orchards that we didn't know about, that weren't on our radar, who have said, come and have a look at what we're doing. And it's been magical. Last weekend, I went up to a fantastic orchard near Muchmarkle and spent the day there looking around and seeing what they had. And it was magical seeing the number of butterflies. So species like red admiral and peacock feeding up on the fallen fruit before they go. These are butterfly species that hibernate as adults. So what they're doing is they're stocking up on all the sugars on that fallen fruit, and then they'll go and find a peeling piece of bark or something in one of those dead trees, and they'll find somewhere to hibernate. They'll literally just slip themselves in and sit there for the whole winter. There were hornets. I saw 2 queen hornets, or princess hornets. So the hornet colonies at the end of their cycle, the princesses have mated and they've gone off, and now they're cavity. They'll sometimes even overwinter in our nest boxes. But most exciting of all in the orchards at this time of year are probably the fungi. So fungi live their life as a mycelium. They're embedded within the tree, this huge network of hyphae that live within the body of the deadwood within a tree. And then each autumn, it can be a cold event, a big rain shower, something that induces them to produce these huge fruiting bodies. And that's what the mushrooms and toadstools and bracket fungi that you see are. Those are the fruiting bodies of the fungi which lives within the tree. And there was an incredibly rare fungus that we saw called the orchard tooth fungus. And I didn't realize quite how rare it was until I looked it up afterwards, but only 30 specimens have ever been found in the UK of the orchard tooth fungus. And simply by having these orchard trees there, the protection of those traditional orchards allows species like that to persist.
So, yeah, I mean, I love the idea of these sort of drunken insects as well. And I just wondered actually if you had your own sort of like cider drinking moment in the orchard at some point. When is it all transformed if you drink the cider in the orchard itself?
Yeah. Well, when David sometimes experiments, and he sometimes produces these quite sort of viciously high alcohol content things, and we have occasionally become the unofficial testers for these, because I think if you tried to sell them to anyone else, you might get sued. But yeah, we have had a few moments where we've become partially inebriated on this stuff that perhaps has been a little bit overbrewed. And yeah, I mean, the orchard is a fantastic place to spend any time of year. But the dawn chorus in spring, and the when it's in full flow in apple season at this time of year, when you've got the smell of all of that rotting fruit on the ground, it's a very sweet and pleasant place to spend a day at this time of year.
Because of course the book starts with January though, doesn't it? It's like straight in winter when it's all really bare, but still you find things then, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing that we do major on, over those winter months is the number of winter thrushes that the orchard supports. I don't know the exact figures, but I think it's well into the millions of redwings, fieldfares, missel thrushes, blackbirds, and song thrushes, which come over from Scandinavia to join our existing populations of missel thrushes and song thrushes and blackbirds already here. And you get these huge roving flocks of winter thrushes that go around looking for fallen fruit in the orchards. And one thing that's so exciting about traditional orchard is almost all of the owners we've met are very sympathetic. They leave a lot of the fruit on the ground. And, even the biggest flocks of thrushes will take months to get through that fruit. And so January, which is often can be a tough month to find species because they tend to be in these bigger flocks. Go to a traditional orchard, because if there's still fruit on the ground, there will be a riot of thrushes all fighting over, these fermenting fruit left on the ground.
It's like a switch has been flicked. If you walk into a traditional orchard from an area of intensively farmed land, it's like a wall. You pass the blackthorn hedge with the hawthorn and all of the other berries, and you come in, and it's a wall of sand. And this is how Nick opens the diary part of the book, is that sound of fieldfares. And this is the thing we've all forgotten in our lifetimes. It's not just about diversity, it's about sheer abundance of life. It's the sheer number of honeybees that we find in the willows in March, that you can hear them from 100 meters away. It's the number of fieldfares and song thrushes singing in the mornings, the number of redstarts that you can hear when they come in May. It's the sheer, every tree has something nesting in it, with no exaggeration. A tree creeper, nuthatch, a blue tit, a grey tit, a goldfinch, a missel thrush. There's something everywhere. And I think that's what you get at this time of year, is this absolute chaos. But remember, it's not just the fruits that are being grown by people. It's the fruits in the hedgerows. So you've got this extraordinary seasonal menu in the hedgerows that goes all the way from the sort of the willow catkins in March, all the way through to the hips, the haws, the sloes, the ivy berries, elderberries, all coming in at a slightly different time of year and providing wildlife with something that gets them through every part of the year. So that's the other thing about the orchards. It's the power of the hedgerows and the life in the hedgerows. The marsh tits, the hazel dormice, the bullfinches, the long-tailed tits is almost as riotous as the life in the orchard.
Yeah, I was wondering if you'd been to any modern orchards, just, as a comparison, just to see what they're like,
I think we have, but we've been to everything in between. So we've been to some orchards that are just starting to be intensified. So, I know one that I think 5-6 years ago had lesser spotted woodpeckers, went back a few years ago, it's been given a haircut, all the old limbs gone. And you can just look at it and go, they've just wiped out a species. But the modern ones, I think Nick and I both find utterly terrifying. And Nick, we drive past a few on the way, don't we? And it's not even the same. It needs to have a different name, I think.
Yeah, it's a very different beast. I mean, the most modern orchards are grown a bit more like you'd see the traditional vineyards. We're used to seeing those espaliered rows of grapevine. That is how a modern orchard is grown now. You have very young trees. They're on grafted stock. They are kept young. They're kept small. They're intensively fed. And they are grubbed up very regularly in favour of productivity. They're absolutely useless for biodiversity. And this argument, that we need to, get as much as possible from the land, is, I think it's wrong. I think we do need to find this balance where we're sharing the land with nature. Land is finite, nature is finite. And the traditional orchard provides that sort of perfect balance between given a land produces and is also fantastically beneficial to the wildlife that lives on it. If we try and sanitize the land to the point where we're getting maximum productivity out of it with these espaliered rows of fruit trees that have got absolutely nothing in the topside or in the soil below, we lose. We kill everything, and that's to net detriment to us.
I mean, go on, Benedict.
The other thing about the traditional orchard, of course, is that it isn't just fruit. It can be livestock. I mean, traditionally, the orchard was the home of the happy pig. I mean, the Gloucester Old Spot is called the orchard pig because people would move their pigs into orchards. The pigs would hoover up so many apples, they occasionally got inebriated and passed out, but they basically had a fantastic life. And then this was in the time when animals could be killed on sight. So, if you had more traditional orchards, there's nothing to prevent horned cattle, maybe small numbers of sheep in some of them, pigs in others, all benefiting from that, premium organic soil, high quality pasture underneath the trees. So it's a diversified landscape. It gives you wood, it gives you charcoal, it gives you cider, it gives you apples, pears, plums, cherries, but it can also give you meat. But a conventional spade orchard only gives you one of those things. So, it's not as productive as people think. It's a factory, but it's not productive, not in the long term.
I mean, obviously you compare it with the woodland pasture that was across so much of the UK as well for so long. But I just wondered what you thought was the difference between them as in terms of biodiversity and habitats.
I would say that
Are they the same thing, really?
No, they're the same thing in terms of structure for some species. The major difference is that we no longer have any of our large herbivores. We once had herds of wild horses, we once had herds of wild cattle, we had sounders of wild boar, we had fairly large predators, we had wolf and we had lynx, and a millennium and a half ago we had bears. So we've lost all of those species, but together created a wood pasture landscape. And there are many other landscapes they would have helped create. They would have helped create open grazeland. But that wood pasture landscape, and the orchard, they are very similar in their structure. The orchard, when it's combined with the hedgerows, the riot of bramble that sticks around the edge of the woodland on the side, the open meadow that's left, that as a collective, that is pretty similar to what we would have had when we had those herbivores that were our landscape managers, and now we have farmers who are our landscape managers. So a lot of the species that evolved in that wood pasture landscape do incredibly well. Your redstarts, your spotted flycatchers, your lesser spotted woodpeckers, your missel thrushes, those species that would have relied on those herbivores to create that structure. They find all of those same niches within a sympathetically managed traditional orchard.
I'm very familiar with a wild orchard in the north of the New Forest, and it's one of the only places in the UK where, as far as we know, horses, pigs and cattle have never been taken off the land. So we may have lost the boar and the aurochs, but for the last 1,000 years, the New Forest has been shaped still by these key animals, horses, cattle, pigs as surrogates, if you like, for boar. And it resembles the orchard. It's striking. One, of course, in Herefordshire is farmed and planted, and it's predominantly rows of apple, albeit in the most wonderful higgledy-piggledy way. Whereas this orchard is a combination of crabapple, yew, rowan, holly, but it's the space and it's the light and it's the ground disturbance. Birds don't like trees that are clumped together. If you go into the middle of a secondary woodland that was planted 30 years ago, straight lines of trees, you'll barely hear a thing. But this place in the New Forest is a riot of life. But as Nick says, often it's the same species popping up again and again. Missel thrush, redstart, spotted flycatcher, cuckoo, things that love sunlit trees in space. And that is wood pasture. It's sunlit trees in space. And it's our richest habitat. Now, if we can create that in the wild, fantastic. But if our farmers can be paid to create it as orchards, then that's a win-win.
Yeah, because obviously that one of the things that you're both really into is this idea that rewilding can be done alongside some sort of farming or human activity. That there's a form of rewilding, because I know that some people say, well, I think there was a report out this week that was saying we've got a domesticated form of rewilding going on in the UK because we don't have various species, the particular predators that you just mentioned earlier.
Which is true. If you take somewhere like Knepp, for example, that is some people might call that rewilding. Some people might argue over the definition of rewilding and say, that's domesticated rewilding. Whatever it is, it's really working. It's, you know, we can sit and argue about semantics, or we can look at that landscape and appreciate it and say, this is working. You know, when you've got a national landscape where turtle doves are in hemorrhagic decline, and you've taken a 3,000 acre estate and turtle doves are booming, you need to look at that and say, we need to champion that landscape. They are doing it right. Something there is really working well. And that's what we would like to champion with any farmed landscape, where the farmers are working with a vision that says, we want to let wildlife in. We want to let wildlife live within the land that we are farming. You know, it's being farmed for people. In the case of Knepp, it was former arable and dairy, and is now being producing mainly meat. You know, the longhorn beef, the Tamworth pigs, the venison from the red deer and the fallow deer, and I'm sure, you know, if the ponies breed, they may sell some of the Exmoors that graze the land there. And I think there is an overarching debate in the UK at the moment about this word rewilding and what it actually means, but it doesn't actually matter. You know, we need to champion the landscapes that are helping, you know, biodiversity and bioabundance recover, and look at examples, because we've got fantastic lessons learned from many different farms across the whole of the British Isles.
Where does Isabella's tree version of wilding fit in your vision?
Well, I think it looks like the very finest extensive grazed land in Romania, which means that it's hooching with life. It has many natural processes. The animals are shaping the landscape. So in many ways, it's ostensibly as wild as it's going to get in Sussex. But of course, you can't fit a lynx into 3,000 acres. You can fit a lynx into landscapes in Scotland. So I think we've got to be sensible about the spatial scale of what we're trying to bring back. The Knepp model for me works incredibly well in southern England. It restores this thorn-studded, chaotic, diverse, scruffy landscape. And Charlie and Izzy would know I mean that as a compliment to their estate. But it is, of course, lacking keystone predators. In my belief, we are ready to reintroduce the lynx into Scotland, because it is not an animal that attacks people, and it very rarely attacks livestock. And then you will see a completely different dynamic in the way that woodlands are planted, in the way that woodlands regenerate at the 100-kilometre level in places like the Cairngorms, Knoydart, Glen Affric, Tayside Forest Park. I believe these places are ready for lynx. But in southern England, where we have a huge concentration of species that you don't find in northern England, turtle doves, nightingales, cuckoos, that Knepp model, which is basically a landscape of vegetation succession competing against low-intensity herbivores, is creating a lost landscape that's not been seen in this country for hundreds of years. And it's incredibly exciting. So whether it's actually rewilding or high-end ecological restoration on farmland doesn't matter. The fact is that it's a landscape that is now determining how it looks, and nature is making the decisions, not people creating a little reed bed and banishing the naughty scrub into the hinterland, which is what we've seen in conventional conservation for too long. It's these rigid categories of, no, nature's being naughty now, we've got to keep these little zoos intact. It doesn't work. It's only when you have this freestyling ecosystem that you begin to see the level of recoveries we're seeing at now. So wheeling out that model across southern England, I think, is a brilliant idea.
Brilliant. Listen, there's Martin is throwing loads of questions in on the Q&A, so I'll come to those in a second. I know Polly asked a question in the chat function, which I know Benedict then answered via a text, which is brilliant. But let's open that up. I can see the value of not removing the dead wood, especially from the orchard floor. But what are your thoughts about pruning trees? Is there a balance to be stuck between habitat, birds, wildlife, and fruit productivity? So Benedict, you did answer that on text. Do you want to talk through the answer?
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, when you speak to a really good traditional orchard manager like David, it's about balancing the tree. So obviously, if you've got a huge pull, whether that's mistletoe or an imbalanced tree, then the risk is the whole tree comes to the ground. Ultimately, of course, that significantly affects fruit productivity, but it also affects the many birds that need standing deadwood to survive, lesser spots, tawny owls, and so on. So pruning does take place at our orchard. It's not a wild habitat, it's a farmed habitat, sympathetically managed. but it's done with a view to protecting the tree as a living organism. It's not done with a view to tidying the tree or removing the dead wood. And often what we find is the most productive trees are living trees with individual dead snags or peeling bark, creating the, kind of like a microhabitat within the tree. But those aren't threatening to pull the tree down. One of the biggest threats to our trees in Herefordshire is mistletoe, which of course is a native. But of course, with climate change, we're not getting as many chill hours over the winter. So the mistletoe is just able to keep sucking water out of the tree across the winter months, which empowers the mistletoe and disempowers the tree, leading to weaker trees, more mistletoe. Then the snow falls on the mistletoe, and the weight of the mistletoe can bring the tree down. So mistletoe pruning has become even more important. So it's not a case of non-intervention. It's a case of working out what uses what on the tree and then doing what you can to keep that tree standing as long as possible.
I think it's also important to remember that the majority of a tree is deadwood. The majority of a live, healthy tree, the heartwood on that tree is dead. And it has this layer of cambium and then this layer of dead bark and then a layer of live bark, which acts as a skin. And it's exactly the same as the skin on our body. And in the same way that we try and avoid infection by not chopping our fingers off, each time you chop off a limb on a tree, you've got to do it for a very good reason, because you're basically doing the exact equivalent of chopping off your hand. You're exposing a whole end of that tree, all of that deadwood, to all of the fungal spores in the air. And there's a very high probability that by chopping off a limb to address the tree for fruit productivity, for example, all you're doing is shortening the life of that tree by exposing an area to fungal spores and fungal attack. And within seconds of taking off, a limb and exposing it, fungal spores will be beginning to land on that. And those mycelium can sometimes take years to develop through the tree, but a wet rot will set in. And you're probably shortening the life of the tree by unnecessarily taking off limbs if you're just looking at it to favor fruit productivity.
Good, Martin. Martin's been very involved in the Q&A. So anyone else, very welcome to use it as well. Martin's first question, quite a poignant one. If orchards are so valuable, why are they not protected? And I will add to that. If I looked out my back window, there's a valley there that looks adjacent to Miswell Lane. That used to be an entire orchard, massive orchard, and is now housing. And that's the typical kind of development that will have gone on in this country over decades, I suspect. But why are orchards not protected, or are they becoming now?
Not really. We'd like them to be. There is growing awareness, but I mean, since the 60s, the Common Agricultural Policy, which I always refer to as the Great Mass Extinction Policy for farmers and wildlife, has paid for these same outcomes to be wheeled out again and again, this homogeny of mass sheep, mass dairy, mass beef, mass animal. And because orchards, they need to be understood. The yield of our orchard is huge. It's the tonnage of apples, but it's the Common Agricultural Policy simplified all of this. So anything nuanced or complex or a little bit difficult to understand wasn't funded and was grubbed out. Farmers were literally paid in the 80s to grub out their orchards. And I see a question from Judith here saying, surely we need to be paying farmers. Yes, we do. Absolutely, we need to be paying farmers for the outcomes that we want. And those are very different outcomes to what we're paying them for at the moment.
Very true. Martin, so many questions. I need to pick and choose which ones to ask. He's doing comments on questions that were already asked. Ecology must not be seen as a silo. Debate. There's a thought. Is that something that rings true with you, Nick?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you have to look at these. You have to look at these systems. As a collective, we have to look at the interaction between all of the different species at play in an orchard to understand what each one needs. One of the most famous declines of all British species at the moment is the loss of our starlings. A lot of work's been gone into why our starling numbers are plummeting, but it would appear that the reason our starling numbers are plummeting is because the main prey that they eat, leather jackets, which eat the roots of grass in particular. They live in grassland. Crane flies lay their eggs, and the larva is called a leather jacket. You will see starlings feeding on the ground, probing into the ground, looking every time their beak hits a leather jacket, it flexes, picks up the leather jacket. It'll take 3 or 4 of these back to its nest. It's having to spend a lot longer to find these because of the way that we now treat these large areas of grassland with either cattle poop full of ivermectins, which kills off all of the soil invertebrates, or with herbicides and pesticides to make sort of a finer quality hay. And as a result, starling numbers are going down. The knock-on impact of that is that, as we have seen to detrimental effect in the orchard, is great spot numbers are going through the roof. You know, great spotted woodpeckers used to be in the same abundance as a lesser spotted woodpecker. Now you can see a great spotted woodpecker in pretty much every garden. They're incredibly easy to spot. They're very conspicuous by their calls. They've got a very loud cat call. And they're a predator. They're a predator, particularly during the breeding season, of tits and cavity nesting species and of lesser spotted woodpeckers. And we watched and we have seen as great spots meticulously work their way through an orchard. They'll tap on the box, they'll listen for the keek of these young chicks, and they'll drill out a little hole right where the chicks are. And they won't bother and go in the entrance hole. They'll just drill a little hole in the side, and they'll pick out the chicks one by one. They'll hammer them into a cleft of a tree, and they'll rip them apart and feed it to their own chicks. Fine, that's part of the system. But now our great spot numbers are booming, and that's going to have a knock-on impact because we have this predator working its way through far rarer species. So yeah, of course, ecology can't be seen as a silo. We have to understand the whole system to understand what's gone wrong in the system, to understand what we can do to fix it, or how we can put the species back in that will help us fix it.
And when I wrote Rebirding, I realised a lot of these answers to these problems can't be found in this country anymore because we are so, everything's separated into its own little zoo. Our ecology is so fractured. But when you go to somewhere like eastern Poland, you realise that the woodlands and the woodland edges are full of starlings. So there aren't many great spotted woodpeckers. So you also notice a bird that we've almost lost to the UK, the willow tit, is breeding in really high numbers because its main predator, the great spotted woodpecker, was kept in check by the starlings. So there's this constant knock-on effects of something. It's a constant domino effect. And often we'll just end up looking at species at the end of their life in the UK and say, oh, so starlings are an urban species, or red-backed shrikes are a heathland species where the heather's got to be this tall. And it's all nonsense. It's because we're studying things in extinction museum mode. Whereas sometimes in traveling to other countries, Hungary, Poland, Estonia, you can actually see how things used to be here. And that, for me, was really formative in thinking about how you can bring these processes back here in the UK.
Yeah, and we've absolutely siloed. The pine marten is now a Caledonian specialist. The golden eagle the red deer is an upland specialist. And the red kite used to live in these tiny pockets of Wales. It's all rubbish. These species thrive around people. Red deer can thrive alongside people. Pine martens can happily live in people's garden in Cornwall. Red deer are a wetland specialist. We've put these animals in these little boxes, as Ben says, because that's where they were left. And we're studying the populations that are left and taking all of our data from that, and it's meaningless.
And almost anything can live beside us if we let it. I was in the Volga Delta in Russia 6 years ago, and we were staying with this old lady, and she came out in the morning and she said via my translator, "Oh, the wolves have been digging up my flowers again. Tomorrow I will chase them off with flaming torch." I said, does she mean the dogs? So he said, no, the wolves. And basically, and then you walk through the village and there's a white-tailed eagle nesting on a 20-foot willow next to a dual carriageway. And you go, oh, right, okay. And then you start reading and realise that, a Scottish estate used to have 200 pairs of white-tailed eagles. So, we had these coexistencies in this country. We had kites doing ecosystem services in London in the 14th century. But then we forgot all the things that nature did for us and took most of it away.
Vicky, I'm conscious you may have 1 or 2 questions left from your little thing. Is there?
Yeah, I've just actually one, just to bring it a little bit smaller, as I'm just thinking, even where I live in the city, there's a couple of small orchards just very close to me, and I'm just wondering what you think. And there's lots of community groups planting orchards as well. How what can we do with these small orchards to make them as diverse and sort of inviting for wildlife as possible.
I think whenever we approach that question of what can we do for wildlife, we can look at what does wildlife want. There are three really simple things that wildlife wants. It wants somewhere to feed, it wants somewhere to breed, and it wants somewhere to hide. And so we can take any species we want, and if we're giving it those three things, it'll thrive. So whether it's in an urban area or in the middle of nowhere, if a species has got those three things, it'll thrive. There's a fantastic charity called the Orchard Project, and they've been doing exactly what you described. They've been working, to restore and create these urban orchards. They're a fantastic community sphere for local people to get involved and understand the process of food production. We are so detached from food production in this country. So I'd argue one of the most important things that a local community orchard can do is teach school groups, local groups, anyone who's interested to find out where their food comes from. Alongside that, I think a nest box project will help engage people. There's nothing more exciting than opening your first nest box and seeing a pile of chicks burst up and shout at you asking for food. It's beautiful. You can see the whole process of how your orchard that you're helping maintain is feeding a family of great hits. So I think on a local scale, if you're giving them somewhere to feed by giving them the fruit trees and keeping a succession of trees going each year by planting new ones, giving them some, and also having a water body, putting in something like a pond, even big troughs of water, old cattle troughs or whatever work really well for that. Putting in a variety of nest boxes, particularly younger orchards don't yet have those cavities. They might not have woodpeckers that have been working through the trees yet. So a nest box project will really help encourage birds and also bats. Bats are prolific users of nest boxes, particularly during the winter months. A lot of our nest boxes at the moment, if we were to go and check them, would have lone roosting bats in. And somewhere to hide. Again, nest boxes do a really good job of that, but also massive log piles, any wood that's taken off the trees to, any fallen trees, keeping that structure there that animals can hide in, like hedgehogs. I think local community orchards are a fantastic thing to get involved in, and I'd encourage everyone to find out where their local community orchard is, and you will meet a really nice group of people just by going and introducing yourself.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I've done a couple of wassailings and stuff like that, so there's a lot of fun ritual around apples as well. I wondered if you got involved in some of that.
Yeah, well, just last weekend I was at a brilliant festival in Herefordshire called the Big Apple, and it was the first time I'd been to the Big Apple. Ben and I were due to speak at it last year. Unfortunately, Ben couldn't make it this year, but it was brilliant to see the local community. They'd opened up 7 different venues for people just to go and look around and understand the process of running an orchard. They had live pressing, so you could see what's called a cheese, that layers of fruit pulp with mesh in between under this giant press that you screw the top on to squash out the juice from the fruit. There were Morris dancers there. There were guided tours, guided walks of the fruit trees so that you could look at it and see how the orchard worked, how fruit selection and choice worked. There were tables that had all the different varieties of apples, hundreds and hundreds of different apple varieties, from little tiny ones. And there was one, I'm going to find the name of it, because they've got these brilliant different names. And what's it called? My favourite little apple at the moment, I know it's a peri pear, is called the Little Cross Huffcap. And you can just see there's so much local culture when you start to engage with food production, particularly at this time of year. I challenge anyone not to be fascinated by going to one of these events and seeing it in live.
And have you two got another project on the go yet? Or, I mean, maybe you're just still in orchard world, you don't really want to move on from the orchard.
Well, Nick and I both have a book in the offing. Next September, I am bringing out a book called Cornerstones, which is looking at ecosystem engineers in real detail, like beavers or lynx. What do these animals actually do when you get inside their world? But Nick, you've got another book on localism in the pipeline as well.
Yeah, I've got a book called My Wild Garden, which is one of the projects I've also been working on alongside the orchard for the last 7 or so years. Is I've been turning my own house, my own garden, which is an ex-council house garden. I can say it's a bog standard house, a bog standard garden. It was a bit of a monoculture when I got it, and I've been spent the last 7 years turning that into a tiny nature reserve, and the results have been phenomenal. purple hair streaks, eyed hawk moths, marbled whites, the species that come into the garden when you give them the choice of things. Great crested newts, grass snakes have turned up. A huge slow worm population. I can find 50 on a sunny day out there. Tiny little postage stamp garden, not huge. And so I'm just going to try and share with readers, what you can do on a small scale to bring wildlife to you. Basically how you can garden, grow wildlife in your garden.
Has your garden got quite a good corridor then for the wildlife to get to? Or is it because
full disclosure, I'm quite lucky in that I back onto a railway cutting. So I chose the house because I'm on the back of the estate, and it backs onto this old railway cutting on the north side of Bristol, and that does act as a corridor. And you're completely right. You're completely dependent on how your neighbours manage their own gardens and what connectivity the species have. But even if you're completely surrounded, you can attract all of the aerial species, all of the moths, all of the butterflies, all of the birds. If they occur in your area and you provide the right spaces for them, you can make small changes that are far more likely to increase the chances of them coming to your green space, your garden.
So I took a lot of inspiration from Nick and basically re-meadowed and scruffied my garden over the last 18 months. And I got back from a film shoot to find that the ragwort, which wasn't there last year, had not only pushed up, but was crawling with cinnabar moth caterpillars. So I got an entire hatch worth of these beautiful black and red moths that had apparently come out of thin air. And I don't even have fantastic habitat connectivity, but there was obviously just enough nearby that when the food plant came up in this otherwise pretty tidy housing estate, these little moths appeared from nowhere. It's a magical process, and it's one that anybody can do.
Mm. It's that connectivity. If every fifth garden, ideally every garden, but if every fifth garden did that down a street, or every 10th garden did that down a street, and you could have super rare species. If every 10th garden had a wych elm in it, you'd have a population of white letter hair streaks, super rare butterfly. But they just need food, and their food happens to be a rare plant. But you put that plant back and they will find it, and you'll have super pretty rare butterflies in your garden. It really is that easy.
Listen, we've been very lucky with some of these events. We had Kate Bradbury a few months ago, and she's specialised in sort of the wildlife ponds, and she was replicating virtually everything you were saying, Nick, to the letter, actually. So many lovely comments. Polly's encouraging you guys to come to our Apple Day next year, and we could do it in Martin's Orchard, apparently. So it's very kind of Polly to recommend Martin's Orchard. Martin has offered his Morris dancing. He's offered for you to see his golden knob. Interestingly, I don't know where that's going, but okay, that's good. But listen, we have hit 8 o'clock, and so that means we've got to draw to a close. Nick and Ben, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute honour to have the pair of you here.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for having us.
Please do invite us to Apple events. We'd be delighted to hear from anyone.
Well, if you've both got books to plug, then let's do it. Let's do something next autumn, and we can make it happen, whether in Martin's Orchard or even in the bookshop. But we can work that out. Vicky, thank you for your time again.
Thank you. Real pleasure.
And can I give Vicky's book another plug, For the Love of Trees? Is there a lot of crossover between your book and the language within?
There's a little bit. I mean, various things, because there's a lot of stuff about rewilding in it, but there's a chapter on gifts of the trees, and that includes things like apples, but can be inspiration. It can be all kinds of different things. So.
The email that all the audience got, and I will put it on the YouTube channel to those people who are watching this after the event, will include a link, does include and will include a link to Vicky's wonderful book, which obviously we've got in the shop. Let me give a little plug. Totally irrelevant events that probably this audience are not interested in. I mean, tomorrow night, Sophie Kinsella's book launch, Party Crasher. That's a bit of commercial fiction. And then next week, Troy Deeney, the Watford striker. Again, that might be pushing it to have this audience be Watford fans as well. But far more relevant, and I'm scrolling down looking for, we've got our festival next month, Sentient. We've got Jackie Higgins coming to talk about what animals reveal about our senses, which I think probably there is some crossover with this audience. But thank you once again to the audience. Thank you to our three authors for making this such a wonderful hour. And let's meet again in person at some point very soon, if not next autumn when you've both got books out. All three of you got books out maybe. And we'll see you all very soon. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.